Is that the beginning of a paragraph?
No, in the middle of a paragraph. We stopped on the next page. But to make it more sense, I've suggested going back to that. But anywhere you want.
Well, I can't find it. That's the problem.
Man is the highest being. Purusha. He's always happy, enjoying the play of life's sports under all conditions and never thinking of the material body, which is the mere abode of the intelligent self. The true self, as we have already seen, possesses prana or intelligence, and prana or activity. These two will be found at the foundation of action. Wherever intelligence or life force or any kind of activity is to be found, there is the expression of the self. No knowledge is possible without self-consciousness. First, we must know ourselves before we can know anything. We may not know our real self on account of imperfect understanding. Still, we possess some kind of self-consciousness. In Vedanta, these two, prajna and prana, are described as the ultimate generalizations of all phenomena of the universe, and they proceed from the cosmic self, or Brahman, which is the source of all knowledge and of the activity of mind and senses.
Oh, okay. There was a misprint. Didn't quite make sense. They were both listed as prana in the beginning, intelligence and activity. And it says prana and prana for both of them, but it's prajna and prana. Intelligence is prajna and prana is activity. All right, so that was why that was a little bit confusing. And yeah, this idea of self-consciousness, of course, the whole idea of creation of the manifest universe is that there's some sort of self-consciousness or awareness that happens rather than being pure consciousness. Brahman has the nature of pure consciousness, infinite existence, consciousness, bliss. But there isn't, it's just consciousness. It's not consciousness of something. And so to have consciousness of something, you have to be in duality or manifestation. And so it's when we come into this idea of duality that we have some idea of consciousness of something. And when that happens, of course, and you get activity as well. You get things happening in space and time. Things appear to be changing and moving. And then you can have consciousness of those changes and movement. All right, so Indra is now going to make a statement here.
Indra said, the self is the greatest being in the universe. When properly understood, we cannot separate this Atman or true self from the universal or cosmic being, because there exists only one ocean of the absolute being, which is called by various names, like God, Brahman, Atman, or self. And that absolute being expresses itself through our forms. It becomes our true self, which is the source of mental and physical activity, as well as of intelligence and consciousness. All desires are certain forms of mental activity, and they could neither rise nor exist if the self-conscious entity were not at the foundation of all activities. He who has acquired self-knowledge can live in the world performing all kinds of works, enjoying all pleasures, and at the same time without being affected or disturbed by any unpleasant condition of this world. The knowledge of self protects the soul from being agitated by phenomenal changes. As a horse being yoked to a carriage makes it move, this conscious self, being attached to the chariot of the body, makes it perform its functions by the knower of prana and prajna. Or we may compare the body to an automobile, the propelling power of which proceeds from the true self. If the self be separated or disconnected from the organs of the senses, the eyes will see no sight, the ears will hear no sound, the nose will smell no odor, the tongue will taste nothing, and the hands and feet will perform no work. Indra continued, The eye itself is only an instrument. The seer is behind the pupil of the eye. The real seer and knower of sight is the true self. The nose is the instrument, but the knower of smell is the true self. The tongue is the instrument of speech, but the knower of speech is the conscious self. The ear is the instrument of hearing, but he who hears is the true self. He who thinks is the true self, and the mind is his spiritual eye. Through this spiritual or divine eye, the self or Atman sees all pleasures and rejoices. The mind, intellect, heart are the instruments of the true self, which is the knower of all mental activities.
The difference between dead and alive. Somehow, when the body is dead, there's no connection, and the self has been separated. And so the eyes are not seeing, and the nose is not smelling, and the tongue is not, etc. And this is the thing that most materialists, you see, can't understand, is that there's something else behind the material body, which makes it appear that the material body has consciousness. But the consciousness is only acting through the material body. So that one spiritual exercise yourself as an actor on a stage, and you might have a role where you go through all sorts of emotions. You have to pretend that you're extremely happy and excited, or extremely frightened and terrified, or passionately in love, or terribly jealous, or whatever it is that the role calls for. And when the play is over, you don't, the play is over, and you don't care about all those things. You detach from all of the emotions. And so when one gains true knowledge of the self, one can live in this world in the same way. Just playing a part, that's all. Just playing a part. And it's not really the self, the true self, that's doing all this. It's just the actor that's going through all of this in this manifest universe, this play of Maya. All right, let's read on about the devas here.
The devas who are in the highest heaven worship and meditate upon this self, and therefore all worlds belong to them, and they have obtained the fulfillment of all desires. He who knows this self and realizes it obtains all worlds and all desires. He who possesses self-knowledge is master of the world, and also lord of everything, like the gods of the highest heaven. In him all desires are fulfilled. He no longer desires anything of the world, but does he seek happiness from outside. He possesses all power. In short, he is omnipotent, omniscient, and ever blissful. Thus the Master explained the mystery of the true self, and the earnest, sincere, and pure-hearted disciple realized it through his blessing. 101 years, as it is said in the story, and that knowledge of the true self.
The greatest scholar in the world, or the greatest pujari in the world, or the greatest chanter in the world. But all of those things are designed to keep our minds motivated and directed towards the goal. So let's continue with what Swami Abhedananda says here.
Therefore, the seeker after self-knowledge abandoned all studies and went to a spiritual teacher who had known the self. He approached him like a humble pupil, longing to acquire self-knowledge. He had no other desire. He did not care to go to heaven or to enjoy celestial pleasures, and his sole aim in ideal life was to know the true nature of the self. Nothing else could please him or make him happy. His heart was longing for that nectar of wisdom which flows in the soul of a knower of the Atman. Though he had come to understand that the physical body was not all in all, and that the mind the director of the senses, was not the unchangeable reality. It was subject to constant change, yet his thirst for knowledge was unquenched. Now he was eager to search after that unchangeable and absolute truth, which is the soul of our souls and the ruler of all. Having bowed his head with deep reverence at the feet of the great spiritual teacher, the pupil asked, "Revered sir, who is it that governs the mind, and by what power is the mind directed to perform its functions? What force guides the prana and the sense powers? Why is it that we are so active? What is the cause of our activity? Who is the speaker of words? Who is the seer of sights? Who is the hearer of sounds? What power controls the organs of sight, hearing, and the other senses?"
Yeah, so these kinds of questions are the kinds of questions that one can meditate on and ponder, and they lead you to that witness consciousness, the self within, that's the guiding principle. Now he's going to go into the Kena Upanishad here, and we can continue reading the next paragraph.
With this inquiry begins the Kena Upanishad, which had been handed down through memory for generations before the art of writing was known in India. It shows how old and sublime are the teachings of Vedanta. Think of the antiquity and the deep meaning of these questions. We know that our mind is constantly active, and new thoughts and ideas are rising and going down.
This is also very true of the other senses. They haven't been studied as much, but sound has been studied quite a bit. And it turns out that, again, our perception of sound is very much a mental construct. Our idea that a melody in one key is the same as the melody played in a different key, that's a mental construct. In fact, it's not universal among various animal species. A bird will recognize a particular bird call, but if you transpose it into a different key, the bird will no longer recognize it. So they don't have that particular ability. And so there's several other examples like that where our perception of sound is seen to be a mental construct. In fact, when you talk on your cell phone has an itsy-bitsy tiny speaker, and yet you can easily tell the difference between male voices and female voices, even though the male voices have very low frequencies, that your little tiny speaker really isn't reproducing. It's just way too small to do that. So how does it do that? Well, your ear takes the pattern of overtones that are produced by those sounds and tells your brain that that's being produced by a low pitch. And so even without huge speakers that can actually reproduce those low vibrations, your brain knows that it came from a low vibration. It's called the phenomenon of the missing fundamental. And so
we can understand that the activities of the sense organs are unconscious by nature. The conscious self, which illumines the organic functions, is the seer of sights, the hearer of sounds, the knower of all sensations, and the thinker of thoughts within us. That intelligent self, which is the source of consciousness and knowledge, must be known as the director of the mind and senses. When we have realized the cause of self-consciousness, we have understood the power which directs the mind.
Yeah, so again, he's reiterating what he did in the previous lecture, which he may have given several weeks or months earlier. There's nothing that says that these were given on consecutive nights or in the same night. So he was giving these lectures at various times, and he's put them all together here as a little book on the nature of the self. And so we're getting some repetition of what we had in the earlier one. And of course, his reference to our mind our minds tend to go to places that we enjoyed being, and we tend to think about them, and so we can think about those places in our mind, and we can mentally go there, and people can reminisce either externally, verbally, or just mentally about going to various places. And of course, we can use this ability again in our meditative practice. Even if we haven't been to a particular place, like say Dakshineshwar or Belur Math, you can read about the descriptions of it, see videos of them, see pictures of them, read the descriptions in the gospel and the great master and so forth. And then you can put yourself in that particular situation. Imagine that you're in one of those situations. And so this mental ability to have the mental activity of going to these various places is something that's useful as a meditative practice. And of course, you can do that in any religious traditions. If you're a Christian, you can do the same thing with the life of Jesus. And of course, that's a very common practice at special times of the year. At Christmas, you can picture yourself visiting the baby Jesus in the manger. Perhaps you're one of the shepherds coming to pay respects, or perhaps you're going through the Stations of the Cross during the Holy Week before Easter, and you try to mentally picture going through those various stations of the cross. So these kinds of activities are common spiritual practices. So let's continue with what he has to say here.
According to Vedanta, mind is finer matter and vibration. The vibration of the mind substance produces perceptions and sensations and reveals things which cannot be revealed by vibrations of grosser matter. In fact, functions of the mind are nothing but the vibrations of the finer particles of the ethereal substance, called in Sanskrit sattva. The vibration of this substance does not produce intelligence or consciousness. It is insentient and inert by nature. The mind substance appears as intelligent when it is in close contact with the conscious self or Atman, just as a piece of iron having absorbed the heat of a furnace appears as red hot and is able to burn. The conscious self may be compared to a magnet which attracts the iron of the mind substance. The piece of iron being a magnet moves. That motion is not natural with the iron, but is caused by its proximity and close contact with the magnet. As the very presence of the magnet produces activity in the iron, so the very presence of our immortal self. So long as we think that we are mortal, we have fear of death. When the consciousness of the immortal self is gained, all fear vanishes. Fear of death arises from ignorance, which makes us forget our immortal nature and identify ourselves with the material body, which is subject to death. Thus, becoming one with the mortal body, we begin to fear death and suffer from anxiety and misery. How can we expect to be free from fear of death when we have identified ourselves with the body which will surely die? This fear, however, ceases to trouble him who has realized that the body is like a shell, or a house, or a receptacle of the soul, which is deathless and immortal by nature. The soul manufactures the physical body in order to fulfill certain desires and purposes of life. He who has known this truth has risen above all fear. Therefore it is said, those who obtain the knowledge of the real self are called the wise. And after the death of the body, they
of meat. And so they have these fears based on their identity of what they're made out of. And of course, by the end of the story, they become more enlightened. And you know, the author of the Oz books was a theosophist, so he had a lot of spiritual ideas behind his his books, and there's a spiritual message there. They're on the road to realization, and of course, the realization doesn't come from anything physical, but from their mental attitude towards themselves, which is what they find out from the wizard eventually. So, and then of course, Dorothy finds out that she can always be free, and going home is like realizing her true self, you see. That's sort of the metaphor there. All right, so let's continue with self-knowledge here.
We've come here to fulfill a certain purpose. At present, we may think that the highest purpose of earthly life is to gain material prosperity, success in business, fulfillment of ambition, and sense desires. The time is sure to come when we shall realize that all these are momentary, that the real purpose of life is much higher and more permanent. It's very difficult to understand the true purpose of life. Few people in this world have found a perfect standard by which they can measure correctly whether or not they have fulfilled that purpose. Each one of us will have to find out what the highest ideal of life is. It is the attainment of self-knowledge. Self-knowledge brings to the soul absolute freedom and happiness. It is by self-knowledge that we can obtain everything we desire in this world. There is nothing higher than the knowledge of the true self. The knowledge which we now possess at present is imperfect. It's only a partial expression of the all-knowing nature of the divine self. That imperfection is due to the limitations or imperfect conditions of the buddhi or intellect, which reflects the divine wisdom. But when the limitations are removed and the intellect is purified, true and perfect wisdom begins to shine within. As for example, if the mirror be covered with mud, it will not have the power to reflect the light of the sun. So when the mirror of the intellect is covered with the mud of worldliness, it does not reflect the light of wisdom, which emanates from Atman, the divine sun. In order to learn this truth and the method by which our intellect and heart may be purified, we need the help of a guru or spiritual master. It should be remembered that knowledge is one and not many. The same knowledge which we now possess will be the highest knowledge when it will reveal our immortal self. Therefore, the wise men who know the true self attain to immortality even during this lifetime.
You know, even in the ordinary sense of knowledge, it seems like we start with very general concepts of knowledge of the world, and we try to get more and more specific, more and more detailed, and so people tend to specialize more and more and more, and looking at tiny little aspects of the subject. And then after a while, you find that this is inadequate, and you need to relate different levels of knowledge, different branches of knowledge. And so then you get people that try to connect the different kinds of sciences or sciences with social sciences and so forth. And then, of course, you get those people that are looking for the theory of everything, that are trying to explain everything with one simple explanation. So it comes complete circle from going into minute details and then trying to find something which puts it all back together again. What is that one knowledge which will enlighten us to understand all knowledge rather than having to learn so many details about everything? So
So that would be self-knowledge?
self-knowledge, yes, self-knowledge is that knowledge actually, not just the knowledge of string theory or something of that nature. But that's the way our minds, our scientific minds tend to go. But it still indicates the direction that we're looking for one thing, that if you understood that one thing, you could explain everything. In actuality, it's not something that will be found in the sciences. It's something that's found in the wisdom of spirit, finding that truth of the self. So we'll do one more paragraph and we'll quit for this evening.
The pupil desired to see the self, which is the director of the mind and the seer of the sight, and by knowing which one becomes immortal. The master said the power of seeing can. But if the eye cannot reveal the self, its nature may be described. To this the teacher replied, words fail to describe it. The mind cannot reach it. We cannot know it by mind, intellect, or understanding. So how can anyone teach it? The self is the thinker of thoughts. Mind can only think when directed by the self, who is beyond thoughts. The very act of thinking presupposes self-consciousness, and all thoughts are
within herself. So from that, we will continue next time with the rest of this lecture by Swami Abhedananda. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. From Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.